Welcome everybody to Ave Baptist Church's Bible Study on Demand. This is Pastor Kevin Swann, and we are delighted that you have decided to join us for this Bible study series. This is part one of a two-part series called The Faith Factor. And faith is such an essential part of how we are to relate to God. As a matter of fact, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 says, "For without faith, it is impossible to really please God." And so today what we'll be doing is looking at how faith plays a critical role in a story. Because in the Bible, it isn't always just a list of do's and don'ts, but there are stories that give us indications of how things play out. And we see in this particular narrative, which is in Matthew chapter 17, and we'll be looking at verses 14 to 21. So I encourage you at this time to get your Bible and let's read through those verses. Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 to 21. This story is also found in Mark chapter 9, verses 14 to 29. But our highlighted version of the story will be in Matthew chapter 17. And I'll be reading that from the New King James Version. And as we are reading, please keep in mind how the role of faith plays an important part in this whole narrative that we are describing today. And so it says, "And when they had come to the multitude, a man came to join him, kneeling down to him and saying, 'Lord, have mercy on my son. For he is an epileptic and he suffers severely, for he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him.' And then Jesus answered and said, 'O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long should I bear with you? Bring him here to me.' And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' Jesus said, 'Because of your unbelief. For surely I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting.'" So what we see in the story is a couple of things. One, we started at verse number 14 in Matthew 17. But if you have some time, I would encourage you to read the first 13 verses of Matthew 17. What you will see there is where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, his inner circle, if you will, his core group of the disciples. Now, Jesus had 12 disciples, but 3 of them were the ones that he was really closest to: Peter, James, and John. And if you notice in verses 1 through 13, Jesus takes his inner circle up on top of a mountain, and there he is transfigured. He is meeting with God, and he's transfigured, and Peter, James, and John are seeing his glory on full display. It's a magnificent scene that takes place. And no sooner than they come off of the mountain where Jesus was transfigured, here now comes a father. And the father comes to Jesus after he had gone to the disciples. So let's do the math. Jesus had 3 of the disciples with him on the mountain. There are 12 disciples total, which means that the father had to have spoken to the 9 disciples that were left while the other 3 were with Jesus on the mountain. Now, the father goes to Jesus after he had first gone to the disciples. And the father is distraught because the father's son is suffering from seizures and epilepsy. And it says that he often falls into the fire and different things are happening. First thing that I want to say about faith here is that there comes a time in all of our lives where there's going to be a situation that is greater than our ability to handle. And in those times, we need to know who to trust and who to go to. In the case of the father, I suspect that, like many of us, maybe he went to some friends first, to some families first, maybe he went to some doctors, and none of them could cure his son. And perhaps along the way, somebody told him about Jesus. And so, being that he couldn't get to Jesus because he didn't know where Jesus was, what the father did know was that Jesus had certain disciples, people who were close to him. So the father goes to the 9 disciples first and asks the disciples, could they cure his son? Now, why is this important? It is important because when we look at Matthew chapter 10, It says there in verse 1 that Jesus had already given the disciples power over unclean spirits to heal and to deliver. So that has already been established, that Jesus gave some authority to the disciples to do things in his name. And one of the things that the disciples could do in his name was to cast out unclean spirits, which in this case would be what the boy was suffering from, an epilepsy or seizures or strokes. Now, I want to put this into context. How many times has Jesus given us a directive and even given us power and authority, and yet we were unable to complete the assignment that God has given to us? Not only is it frustrating to us, but it is also frustrating to the people around us who may need what God has given us in order for them to be blessed. And so the Father did the right thing. He went to the disciples first because he imagined that because they were connected to Christ, that they could do for Christ what Jesus was not able to do in their presence. Now let's fast forward today. Christ is not with us in physical form, but he left the church or the body of believers. Now, that is not to say that every child of God is able to heal miraculously and deliver miraculously, but the implication is clear. And that is that while Jesus is gone and he sent the Holy Spirit to us, the church or the body of believers ought to be able to offer things to the world on behalf of Christ in his absence. As a matter of fact, this is what Jesus expects, that the gospel will continue to go forward, that lives will be saved, that people will be delivered and touched, even though he is not physically with us. So if we're seeing things in the world and things happening in our communities, people shooting and killing and all types of issues that are taking place, the question maybe we need to ask is not where is God, but where is the power of the church and the people that God has commanded and empowered to do the work while Jesus is still in heaven. And so the biggest reason why there's a lack of power seen in the verse, why the disciples could not cure the Father's Son, is the same reason why we're seeing challenges in our society today that are not being addressed. And that is a lack of faith amongst the believers. Many believers struggle with their existence when it comes to God. As a matter of fact, this is true in the Bible as a whole. In most cases, every person that God went to say, I've called you to do a greater work, most of the time, we all have a similar reaction. Who, me? Why are you choosing me? And you need to be choosing someone else. It's the same thing that God did when he called Moses. And Moses said, no, you must be confused. I've killed a person. I have a speech impediment. My brother Aaron is more eloquent in speech than me. Why don't you choose him? And yet God chose Moses for a reason. God chose Abraham for a reason. God chose David for a reason. God chose Paul for a reason. And guess what, my friend? God chose you for a reason. There is an assignment on your life. There is something that God has equipped you to do that no one else can do, and he's entrusting you to do it. And for many of us, the only reason why we don't do it is not because necessarily we don't want to. It's maybe because we are afraid. Maybe we really don't believe we can do it. Maybe we've looked back over our life and seen how many mistakes we've made, how many things we've done wrong, and even some of the struggles that we currently have. And we put all of that together and we say to ourselves, God, there's no way you could be choosing me because of look at all the things that I've done. But I want to encourage you as we continue in the second part of this series to know that if God has chosen you, there's nothing you can do about it. And there's nothing that you can do to change his mind. What we need to have is the faith to accept that this is what God desires of me, have the faith to accept that God can use me in this way, and have the faith to believe that no matter what has happened in my life previously, that God still loves me, God still cares for me, and God still has a great assignment for my life. The disciples missed this point because they could not cure the boy, even though Jesus had already empowered them to do so. And the only reason why they could not cure the boy was because of their lack of faith. Faith is an essential element to the believer. We can love God all we want, but loving God and trusting God is two totally different things. Now, I want to be clear before we end this video that there are different types of faith. There is saving faith, and that is I accept Christ into my life. I believe that Jesus died on the cross for my sins, and now I become a believer. That is saving faith. But saving faith and trusting God to save me from eternal damnation is very different than a faith that says I trust God to change my life and to be able to do things that I previously could not do before. That's a different kind of faith. And that's the faith that the disciples struggled with in the text. They believed Christ enough to follow him, but they didn't believe Christ enough to know that they had the power to change somebody's life. And my friend, you have that same power. God has already given it to you. He has said in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 5, that we are ambassadors. We are called to go into the world to share the good news of Christ on his behalf to help people to be reconciled to God. I don't care what mistakes you've made in your life. I don't care what you've done or maybe what you're struggling with. If God has called you an ambassador, now is the time for you to have faith to believe that you are who God has said you are. So we're going to end here today with the faith factor. We're going to come back in part 2 and continue the narrative of the story. But I want to end with this. Hebrews 11:6, for without faith, it is impossible to please God. There are many things that could happen in your life and people around you could be blessed if you simply believe that God can use you in a great way. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for part 2 coming up. Until next time, be blessed.